to discuss what is a nutrient and how is a nutrient different from food, and does it really matter the difference. My name is Subiri Ogbogo. I'm a medical doctor and specialist in public health medicine. So any edible matter is what you call food. However, not everything that we eat is going to be digested and used by the body. So the components of food that are digested and absorbed and used for energy, reproduction, growth is what you call a nutrient. So when you eat food, what you are looking for is a nutrient. There are 5 groups of nutrients: carbohydrates, proteins, fats, vitamins and minerals. You can also add water and alcohol. So how many nutrients are there in some common sources of food that we eat? So for example, if I take a slice of bread, I'm consuming 15 grams of carbohydrates and 2 grams of protein. If I take a medium-sized fruit, I'm consuming 15 grams of carbohydrates. If I take 1 teaspoon of sugar, I'm consuming about 4 grams of carbohydrates. Now, what is important to remember is that there is a minimum amount of carbohydrates that you should be consuming. So if you consume too low or too high, then that can affect your health outcomes. So the minimum amount of carbohydrates for a 1-year-old or a 50-year-old is the same, and that is 130 grams per day. That is the minimum amount of carbohydrate required to provide energy for the brain to function. Remember, the requirements can be higher depending on your physical activity level, but that is the minimum. Now, what is interesting is that the amount of carbohydrates for a 1-year-old and a 50-year-old is the same. That is why children should consume snacks or foods in different quantities at different times. Remember, a child cannot consume 130 grams of carbohydrates in 3 meals. So they require small meals regularly. Now, what about proteins? Now, we get proteins from things like milk, meat, eggs, beans. So one cup of milk will give you about 8 grams of proteins. But remember, you also have carbohydrate in milk in form of sugar. So 1 cup of milk will also give you 12 grams of carbohydrates. 1 medium-sized egg will give you 6 grams of protein. Remember, there's no carbohydrate in protein. 3 ounces of meat. When we talk about an ounce, is basically a standard measurement for meat, and usually it's equivalent to a computer mouse or a deck of cards. So 3 ounces of meat will have 20 grams of protein. Remember, again, as I've said, there is no carbohydrate in proteins. Now, what about things like poultry? 3 ounces of poultry will give you about 16 grams of protein. Fish has slightly more protein. 3 ounces of fish will give you between 16 and 25 grams of proteins. Now, things like beans contain both proteins and carbohydrates. So a cup of dried beans will give you about 16 grams of 16 grams of protein and 45 grams of carbohydrates. So remember, you can get the same amount of protein from consuming a cup of dry beans. Is the same amount of protein you'll get from consuming, for example, 3 ounces of fish or meat. So what's the minimum requirement for protein per day? Usually it ranges, but for women it should be 46 grams of protein per day, and for men about 56 grams of protein per day. Remember, this figure can vary depending on your physical activity level. For example, people who exercise regularly might require slightly more intake of proteins. But remember, in most cases, particularly for middle class and upper class, they tend to consume much more proteins that they need. So for example, 1 egg has about 6 grams of protein. It means if I consume 5 eggs, I've already consumed almost 3/4 of my daily requirement of proteins per day. Now, if I'm going to take again meat for lunch, fish for dinner, then I may end up consuming much more than I need. Now, fats is found also in mainly animal sources of proteins, things like milk, meat, fish, as well as milk. So remember, like a cup of milk, if it's whole milk, will give you about 8 grams of fat and about 8 grams of proteins. A tablespoon of butter will give you about 7 grams of fat. Now, the other important components is what you call macronutrients. So macronutrients refers to the nutrients that are required in large quantities. Usually they are measured in grams. So carbohydrates, proteins, and fats are required in large quantities. So you can see the measurements I've been using are in grams. Micronutrients are required in small quantities and basically includes vitamins and minerals. They're usually measured in milligrams or micrograms. So remember, all the foods I've mentioned, milk, meat, beans, fruits, will also contain vitamins and minerals. But remember, there's also a minimum requirement for vitamins and minerals for you to have a balanced diet. But we can't discuss that in this episode. Finally, you might have heard about essential and non-essential nutrients. Remember, essential nutrients means they have to be taken in diet. Non-essential simply means the body can make them from other components of food. So thank you very much for listening. This podcast is brought to you by Kike Afya. My name is Subiri Obwogo. Please support us by liking, commenting, as well as subscribing to my YouTube channel, the link of which is shared below.